Imagine a simple man, a shepherd of flocks and cultivator of fig trees, living in a small and quiet village. He held no degrees, was not trained in the scriptures, nor was he someone recognized among the great ones of his generation. Yet suddenly, this ordinary man was chosen by God for an extraordinary mission, to confront kings and religious leaders, to denounce wickedness, and to proclaim a divine judgment that no one wanted to hear. This man was Amos, a prophet who emerged from the obscurity of Tekoa to become one of the boldest and strongest voices in biblical history. Amos was born in Tekoa, a peaceful village in the heart of Judah. The surrounding landscape was made up of vast fields, golden hills beneath the scorching sun, and fig trees swaying gently in the breeze. It was a land of shepherds, shaped by the simple rhythm of rural life in that almost forgotten corner of the world. No one could have imagined that there would grow a man destined to become one of the most steadfast voices of his generation. From an early age, Amos lived a seemingly unchanging routine. He cared for his family's sheep, leading the flocks along the hillsides, always watchful of lurking dangers. When he was not in the fields, he dedicated himself to cultivating fig trees, especially sycamores, which required meticulous care to bear fruit. Young Amos, with calloused hands and a sharp gaze, learned to listen to the sounds of nature and to read its signs. To those who saw him, he was nothing more than a common shepherd, perhaps even a little reserved, far removed from the great cities and their noise. Yet there was something unique about Amos, even if he was not fully aware of it. His eyes reflected a restlessness, a sensitivity to injustices that sometimes reached even the remote corners of Tekoa. When he heard stories brought by travelers about Samaria and its wealth, about the oppression of the needy and the greed of the powerful, he felt something different, an indignation that would not let him rest. While the world went on as usual, a greater voice, silent yet unmistakable, began to stir within him. It was as if the wind sweeping across the hills carried a divine whisper, a calling he did not yet fully understand. Until one day, that silence was broken in an unexpected way. The dawn seemed no different from many others. The sun rose slowly on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of gold and orange, while Amos guided his flock along the slopes. The sound of the sheep bells blended with the rustling of leaves and the gentle song of birds. Everything felt so serene, so ordinary, but something was about to happen, something that would forever change the destiny of that man. It was then, alone, watching the sheep graze, that Amos felt the call. It was not an ordinary voice, one to which a man replies with words. It was more like a weight upon his chest, a fire running down his spine, seizing his entire being. It was as though the wind passing through the trees carried more than just air. It carried a presence, an urgency. Amos, who had never considered himself special, realized that God was speaking to him, and it was not a small calling. He, a simple man, accustomed to the silence of the fields and the labor of his hands, was sent to speak on behalf of the Creator. And it would not be an easy message. Amos was to go to the kingdom of Israel in the north and confront the powerful with firm words. He would denounce the injustices, greed, and corruption that had taken hold of the land. Think of the weight of such a task, an unknown shepherd with no prestige or recognition, being sent to challenge kings and priests. Amos knew the path ahead would be hard. He had no formal training and no eloquence. "I'm only a herdsman," he may have thought, but there was no room for refusal. When God calls, even the simplest of men becomes capable of extraordinary deeds. Thus, Amos left behind the fields of Tekoa and set out on his journey northward, not knowing exactly what awaited him. The kingdom of Israel was waiting, a kingdom prosperous on the outside, yet corrupted within. And Amos carried with him the message that would be like thunder breaking the false silence of that nation. The journey to the kingdom of Israel was long and filled with uncertainties. Amos carried only what was essential. His staff, the experience gained in the fields, and the conviction that he was obeying the call of the Lord. As he drew nearer, the reports about Israel became clearer and more disturbing. The kingdom was prosperous far beyond what Judah could dream of. The cities displayed splendid palaces, bustling marketplaces, and magnificent feasts. But behind this fleeting brilliance, Amos heard stories of oppression, corruption, and a shallow faith that looked more like a spectacle than true devotion. Upon arriving, the contrast was striking. Samaria, the capital, gleamed with the display of wealth. The main avenues showcased fine fabrics, glittering jewels, and the laughter of those who seemed to have everything. Yet a glance into the hidden alleys revealed another reality. The wretched crushed by poverty, slaves burdened with endless tasks, and starving children. Amos needed little time to see what was wrong. The wealthy lived as if untouchable, exploiting the labor of the poor. Justice, meant to be a right for all, had become a privilege for the few. Religion, meant to be the moral foundation of the nation, had turned into a performance. The altars overflowed with costly offerings, but the hearts were empty of repentance. The people of Israel had drifted away from the Lord, trading genuine worship for pompous and convenient rituals. Amos saw it all and understood that his message would not only be difficult to endure, it would be like a sharp blade against a people who preferred to ignore the truth. As he walked through the streets of Samaria, hearing the hum of the marketplaces and the chants echoing from the temples, Amos knew his moment was near. He did not know how or when it would happen, but he was certain of one thing: his voice would carry the truth. Soon, it would thunder through the palaces and squares of that prosperous yet spiritually sick kingdom. The opportunity to speak came faster than Amos expected. He was in Samaria, surrounded by the city's splendor, when he began to proclaim his message. There were no ceremonies, no preparations. Amos simply lifted his voice, and it was as if the heavens themselves roared. His first words could not be ignored. The Lord will roar from Zion and from Jerusalem. He will raise his voice. It was like lightning tearing through the silence. Passers-by stopped to listen, more out of curiosity than reverence. After all, who was this man dressed like a shepherd, daring to speak with such authority? Amos's words were direct, without disguise. He began by denouncing the neighboring nations, pointing out their cruelties and atrocities. The people of Israel listened with a certain satisfaction, for it seemed that he was only condemning their enemies. But then, like the roar of a lion turning upon them, Amos directed his accusation against Israel. His voice grew even firmer, more urgent. He began denouncing the rich who exploited the poor, the rulers who turned justice into merchandise, and the priests who made a spectacle out of faith. You who crush the needy and impose unjust taxes. You have built luxurious houses, but you will not live in them. You have planted magnificent vineyards, but you will not drink their wine. Amos's words cut like swords, exposing truths that everyone knew but no one dared face. It was as though he tore away the veil, hiding the kingdom's decay. He spoke with an authority that was not his own, but God's. Each sentence struck the listeners' consciences. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others muttered, trying to diminish the importance of this simple man. But Amos stood firm. He knew his message was a warning, a final call for Israel to change its ways, and though hard to hear, his words were only the beginning. While his voice still echoed through the streets of Samaria, something deeper began to unfold. God did not give him words alone, but also powerful visions, images that spoke for themselves before his very eyes. The first vision appeared as a lush green field, seemingly fertile and full of life, but suddenly a swarm of locusts came, devouring everything in its path. Nothing was left, neither food nor hope. Amos felt the weight of that scene and quickly understood its meaning. Israel was about to lose everything. The prophet could not hold back and interceded, pleading that God would have mercy and not utterly destroy. For a moment, it seemed the Lord had listened, but the revelations continued. In the next vision came fire. It was no ordinary fire, but one that consumed even the depths, drying up the rivers and burning the land down to its roots. It was terrifying, almost suffocating, as if Amos could feel the heat on his own skin. Once again, he cried out to the Lord for mercy, but God was showing the gravity of the situation, something that could no longer be ignored. The third vision was surprisingly simple, yet rich with symbolism. Amos saw the Lord holding a plumb line, that small tool builders use to ensure a wall is straight. But now the plumb line was in the hands of the Creator, who used it to measure Israel. The message was clear. The people were crooked, out of alignment. God, the great architect of the universe, would not tolerate a moral structure on the verge of collapse. Amos's words struck at the very root of Israel's arrogance, and that disturbed many. Among those who felt threatened was Amaziah, the priest of Bethel. He was an influential man, a representative of the kingdom's official religion. For Amaziah, the temple at Bethel was more than a place of worship. It was a symbol of power and prestige. But now this prophet from the south was shaking its very foundations, denouncing it all as false and corrupt. The priest knew he had to act quickly and tried to discredit Amos in every way possible. First, he sent a message to King Jeroboam, warning that the prophet's words were dangerous. Amos is conspiring against you. His words are unbearable to the people. Amaziah wanted the king to believe that Amos was a political threat, a rebel sowing unrest. But Amos would not be intimidated. He knew his mission came from God himself. When political pressure failed, Amaziah confronted him personally. He tried to belittle him, mocking his humble origins as if they were something shameful. "Go away, seer," he said with irony. "Go prophesy in Judah. Here in Israel you have no place." But Amos's words stood like an unshakable rock. He looked at Amaziah and replied firmly, "I am not a prophet, nor the son of a prophet. I am a shepherd, a dresser of sycamore trees. But the Lord took me from tending the flock and said to me, 'Go, prophesy to my people Israel.'" It was a powerful declaration. Amos was not there by his own will, nor for personal gain. He had been sent, and nothing, not even Amaziah, could turn him away from his mission. But the tensions only grew. Resistance against the prophet increased, and the people began to divide between those who rejected him and the few who dared to listen. Amos's words, sharp as blades, continued to echo in Israel's palaces and marketplaces. He stood in the squares, proclaiming truths no one else had the courage to speak. One day, staring directly at the wealthy merchants dressed in their elegant robes, Amos spoke with a tone that mixed indignation and lament. "You cows of Bashan," he declared, referring to the elite of Samaria. It was a bold, almost provocative metaphor, comparing them to the well-fed cows that grazed on the fertile plains of Bashan, known for their abundance. They lived in comfort, but at the expense of the oppressed. Amos described scenes of greed and oppression with striking clarity. He spoke of fraudulent scales in the markets, of merchants who reduced the measure of grain while raising the prices. He denounced that even the chaff of the wheat, which should have been discarded, was sold to the poor as if it were food. And he did not stop there. With a steady voice, he turned against the religious leaders who performed grand ceremonies at the altars of Bethel and Gilgal, but whose hearts were far from God. I despise your religious feasts," Amos proclaimed. The shock was immediate. He declared that the sacrifices and songs filling the temple were useless because they did not come from sincere hearts. Amos's message was becoming unbearable for the rulers, but he knew he had to press on. There was still more to be said, more to be revealed. Amos kept preaching even in the face of resistance. He was aware that his declarations were harsh, But he was also fully certain that God never sends a warning without also leaving behind a promise of renewal. In the midst of his announcements of ruin and judgment, Amos began to proclaim something different. He spoke of restoration, of a time when everything would be set in order again. It was as if, in the darkness of a starless night, he pointed to a flicker of light on the horizon. His words formed images that touched the soul, even of the hardest of hearts. He spoke of vineyards overflowing with fruit, of fertile lands where the harvest would be so abundant that the workers could hardly keep up. The days of hunger and lack would be replaced by a time of joy and plenty. But it was more than that. Amos also described a people gathered once again. Those who had been scattered, who had lost their roots, would be brought back. They would rebuild the ruined cities, cultivate gardens, and live in peace. It was a promise that seemed unlikely to many. After all, the scene before them was one of inequality, exploitation, and impending judgment. Even so, Amos's words were like seeds cast upon dry ground, waiting for the right moment to sprout. As Amos shared this vision of distant hope, he knew resistance was growing. People were restless, and the powerful were more opposed than ever. And while he spoke of a restored and distant future, the present reality was danger and uncertainty. His mission was reaching a decisive point, and the silence that approached seemed more frightening than his warnings. After everything had been proclaimed, after all the revelations spoken and truths announced, Amos began to withdraw from the eyes of the people. His task seemed to be coming to an end, not because he had given up or lost heart, but because in some way he had already declared everything that needed to be said. The words that once roared like a lion now gave way to a silence heavier than any speech. The people who had heard him remained divided. Some still reflected on his declarations, trying to grasp the weight of those promises and warnings. Others, especially the influential, preferred to act as though none of it mattered. "Who is he anyway?" they murmured, dismissing the prophet who now returned to the paths of Judah. But the truth is that the impact of Amos was already imprinted. His words continued to spread like waves that no one could stop. The lack of records about the last days of his life only deepens the mystery. He simply disappears from the pages of history, leaving no account of how his journey ended. Perhaps he returned to the fields of Tekoa to tend sheep and fig trees, living out his remaining days in peace. Or perhaps he continued proclaiming his message, even in places where few were willing to listen. What we know is that the silence that followed was not an ending, but a pause. It was as if his absence was part of the purpose, a blank space for the people to reflect and decide what to do with all they had heard. Even so, the story of Amos did not fade. His words remained alive, passed from generation to generation, as a reminder of what justice, righteousness, and courage to obey God's call truly mean. The messages of Amos, though rejected at first, continued to spread like seeds carried by the wind. His preaching, simple at its core, carried a force so intense that it could not be ignored. Each phrase held the weight of a conviction that came directly from the Lord. He was not an ordinary man. Even without titles or a prophetic lineage, he left a mark that crossed the centuries. It was as if his journey echoed beyond his own lifetime, always challenging and inspiring. As time went on, the truths Amos proclaimed became impossible to erase. The vision of the plumb line, the river of justice, the cows of Bashan, all these images remained etched in the collective memory, serving as a mirror for a society in desperate need of transformation. And not only in Israel, but anywhere injustice and falsehood tried to stifle the will of God. Amos showed us that true devotion is not found in grand ceremonies or luxurious temples, but in justice flowing like a river and righteousness being lived out as a way of life. His voice rose in defense of those who had no voice. For the humble and oppressed, exploited by the powerful, he represented the courage that is born from a divine calling, the boldness to proclaim the truth, even when no one wanted to hear it. To this day, the legacy of Amos remains alive, not only in his sermons, but in every act of justice, in every gesture of kindness that reflects the heart of God. His journey is a reminder that true transformation often arises in unlikely places, many times through ordinary people. And as we reflect on his life, one question emerges: what are we doing to ensure that the river of justice continues to flow? Perhaps, just like Amos, we too are being called to something greater, something that requires courage and faith to accomplish. And so his story intertwines with ours, inviting us to listen, to act, and to transform the world around us. The walk of Amos ends, as it began, without great highlights, but with a strength that crosses the centuries. He was only a shepherd, a man with hands marked by labor and feet hardened by the dust of the road, yet he was set apart to carry a message that would shake a nation. Not because of his eloquence or social status, but because of his faithfulness and trust in God. And that is what makes his mission so unique. Amos reminds us that the Lord does not choose the qualified, but qualifies those he calls. From the hills of Tekoa to the streets of Samaria, Amos delivered a lesson that still echoes today. True worship of the Lord is found in acts of justice and compassion. It does not matter how many songs we sing or how many altars we build. If the heart is not sincere and our actions are not righteous, everything becomes empty. He teaches us that faith is not comfort, but a calling to face the harshest realities, even if it means going against what is popular or convenient. Moreover, Amos challenges us to see those the world prefers to ignore. He raised his voice for the poor, the exploited, the forgotten. He showed that closing our eyes to injustice does not exempt us from responsibility. On the contrary, it makes us complicit in it. When he cried out for a river of justice and a stream of righteousness, it was not only an exhortation to Israel, but a universal calling, valid for every time and every place. Perhaps this is his deepest lesson. God can use anyone in any situation to fulfill his purposes. The only condition is that we are willing to listen and obey. Just like Amos, we can be the voice of the voiceless, a channel through which the justice of God flows. The question that remains is, are we ready to say yes to the calling, even if it leads us through difficult paths? Because, as Amos demonstrated, it is in that yes that the stories that truly matter are born. If you were inspired by the life of the prophet Amos and want to discover more stories of faith and overcoming, leave a like on this video. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any new content. Let's dive together into more powerful teachings from the Word of God. Click on the suggested video on your screen and follow along with the next message.